This is January 1st, 1834, a cold morning in Talbot County, Maryland. There was a 16-year-old enslaved boy walking down a road with a small bundle of clothes tied to a stick over his shoulder. His name was Frederick Douglass, though he wouldn't be called that for a few more years yet. Right then, he was still Frederick Bailey. He was being sent to a man named Edward Covey. Everyone in the area knew who Covey was. He had a reputation. They called him the slave breaker. Here's how it worked. When a slave owner had someone they considered difficult or unruly or rebellious, they'd send that person to Covey for a year. Covey would rent them, basically. He'd use them to work his farm, and in the process he'd break them. He'd turn them from a person with spirit and resistance into what slave owners wanted, someone docile, obedient, and completely broken. Covey was really good at it. So good that some slave owners would send their slaves to him for free, just for the training. They'd let Covey use their enslaved people for a whole year without any payment, because the value of getting them back broken was worth more than a year's rent. Frederick Douglass was being sent there because his master, Thomas Auld, thought he'd been ruined by city life. Douglass had spent most of his childhood in Baltimore, where he'd learned to read and write. He'd been treated with what he described as comparative tenderness. But Auld thought that had made him unsuitable, too independent, too questioning. So Auld decided Douglass needed to be broken, and Edward Covey was the man to do it. Edward Covey was a poor man. He was just starting out, trying to build his fortune in a system where the first step to wealth and respectability was owning other human beings. He rented a farm, and he rented enslaved people to work it. He couldn't afford to buy many slaves himself, but he'd managed to scrape together enough money to buy one. Her name was Caroline. She was about 20 years old, and Covey bought her, as he openly said, as a breeder. Let me be clear about what that means. Covey bought this woman with the specific purpose of forcing her to have children that he would own. He hired a man named Bill Smith from a neighboring plantation to live on his property for a year. And every single night, Covey locked Caroline and Bill Smith in a room together. At the end of the year, Caroline gave birth to twins. Covey was ecstatic. His wife was ecstatic. They celebrated like they'd just acquired valuable property, which in their minds they had. The children were considered additions to Covey's wealth. That's how the system worked. That's what slavery enabled. Frederick Douglass, who lived in that house and witnessed all of this, wrote about it years later. He said that while people in the North would read about it with disgust and shame, people in the South would laugh at it and call Covey smart, would praise him for finding a way to increase his human stock without having to buy more slaves. This was the man Frederick Douglass was being sent to live with for a year. Covey's farm was about 300 or 400 acres. The household consisted of Covey and his wife, Covey's wife's sister who had a broken back, a cousin named William Hughes, Caroline the cook, Bill Smith, who was the hired man forced to breed with Caroline, and now Frederick Douglass. The working force was Bill Smith, William Hughes, and Douglass. 3 men to work hundreds of acres. Within a week, Covey had whipped Douglass savagely. He cut his back and raised ridges on his flesh. Over the next 6 months, Covey whipped him roughly once a week. The wounds barely had time to heal before new ones were added, but the physical abuse was only part of it. Covey worked his slaves from before dawn until after dark. He gave them enough food to survive, but not enough time to eat it. He made them work in all weather. Hot, cold, rain, snow, it didn't matter. During harvest time, they'd often be kept in the fields until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And Covey had this habit that made everything worse. He'd work alongside his slaves in the fields, which sounds like it might be better, but it wasn't. Because Covey would use elaborate tricks to spy on them. He'd tell them he was going away for days and give them their orders in advance. Then he'd hide somewhere on the property, behind bushes, lying flat in ditches, crawling through cornfields, watching to see if anyone slacked off. The enslaved people on his farm called him the Snake. He was always sneaking around, always watching, always ready to catch someone and punish them. It created this atmosphere of constant fear and paranoia. You could never relax. You could never rest. Because you never knew if Covey was actually gone or just hiding somewhere watching you. Think about what that does to a person. Imagine living every single day knowing you're being watched, but not knowing when or where from. You're exhausted from working before dawn until after dark, but you can't take even a moment to rest because he might be hiding in the cornfield watching you. You're starving because there's not enough time to eat the food you've been given, but you can't stop to eat because he might pop up from behind a bush and beat you for being lazy. Douglas wrote that this constant surveillance was part of Covey's technique. It wasn't just about working people hard. It was about breaking their spirit through psychological manipulation, making them feel like they were never safe, never free from his gaze, never able to have even a moment to themselves. It was torture disguised as farm management. Covey was also deeply religious. At least he presented himself that way. He'd pray every morning and every night. He was a member of the Methodist Church, a class leader. He'd sing hymns with his family. But here's the thing. He'd make short prayers in the morning so the slaves wouldn't get a break from work, and long prayers at night when the work was done anyway. Every single aspect of his supposed faith was calculated to maintain control. Frederick Douglass had to read the hymns for Covey during family worship because Covey couldn't read well. Sometimes Douglass would refuse, just as this small act of defiance. Covey would get flustered and have to stumble through the hymns himself, struggling with the words. Then he'd pray with even more fervor than usual, as if trying to convince himself of his own righteousness. Douglass wrote that he truly believed Covey sometimes deceived himself into thinking he was a sincere worshiper of God. That Covey prayed and sang hymns and went to church while simultaneously forcing Caroline into repeated sexual assault, while beating teenagers until they bled, while creating an environment of terror and brutality. And somehow Covey convinced himself that he was a good Christian man doing God's work. For the first 6 months, Covey successfully broke Frederick Douglass. Douglass described it in his own words. He said his natural elasticity was crushed. His intellect languished. The spark in his eyes died. He was transformed from a man into a brute. The constant work, the constant beatings, the constant fear, it destroyed something in him. He fell into this state where he just existed, just survived, with no thoughts of freedom or dignity or anything beyond getting through each day. This is important to understand. Frederick Douglass was someone who'd learned to read and write. He was intelligent, thoughtful, aware of abolition movements and ideas about freedom. He'd spent years in Baltimore, where he'd had some measure of independence. He wasn't someone who'd been ground down by a lifetime of plantation labor. And even he, with all those advantages, was broken by Covey's methods within 6 months. Douglass wrote that the disposition to read departed from him. He'd loved reading, had risked punishment to learn, had seen it as his path to freedom. And Covey's treatment crushed that part of him. The cheerful spark that had lingered in his eye just died, He became exactly what Covey was being paid to create. Someone with no will, no spirit, no resistance. Just a body to work until it broke. That's what slave breaker actually meant. It wasn't just beating someone into submission. It was systematically destroying everything that made them human. Their curiosity, their hope, their sense of self, their dreams. All of it crushed under the weight of endless labor, constant surveillance, and regular brutality. Then came that day in August. It was one of the hottest days of the month. Douglas was working with 3 other men, fanning wheat. That's where you expose cut grain to the wind to blow the chaff away. One man was clearing the wheat. One was turning the fan. One was feeding grain into it, and Douglas was carrying wheat to the fan. The heat was brutal. Douglas had been worked to exhaustion for months. His body just gave out. He collapsed. He got dizzy and weak and couldn't stand up. Covey found him lying on the ground and immediately assumed he was being lazy. He gave Douglas a savage kick in the side and told him to get up. Douglas tried. He tried several times. Each time he failed to get up, Covey beat him harder. Finally, Covey took a hickory stick and hit Douglas in the head with it. The blow opened up a large wound, and blood ran freely down his face. But something in Douglas had changed. Instead of just accepting it, instead of lying there and taking it, he mustered up the courage to stand up and walk away. He walked 7 miles to his master Thomas Auld's house to report what Covey had done to him. 7 miles in the heat, bleeding from his head, exhausted and injured. He thought maybe his master would protect him. He thought maybe Auld would see that Covey had gone too far. Auld didn't care. He told Douglas he deserved the beating. He sent him back to Covey. No protection, no intervention, nothing. Just sent him right back to the man who'd nearly killed him. Douglas hid out in the woods for a day. He knew going back meant more beatings, maybe worse, but he had nowhere else to go. The system offered him no protection, no recourse, no help. So eventually, he returned to Covey's farm. The next day changed everything. Covey tried to sneak up on Douglas early in the morning while he was in the stable. He tried to tie Douglas's legs so he could beat him without resistance. But this time, and Douglas himself said he didn't know where the spirit came from, he fought back. Douglas grabbed Covey by the throat. Covey was shocked, terrified even. He called for help from William Hughes, another white man on the property. Douglas kicked Hughes in the ribs and knocked him down. Then Covey called for Bill Smith, that enslaved man who was being forced to breed with Caroline. But Bill Smith refused to help. He just walked away and let them finish their fight. Douglas told Covey straight out that Covey had used him like a brute for 6 months, and that he was determined to not be used that way any longer. Then they fought. They fought for nearly 2 hours. It ended in basically a draw, but here's the important part. Douglas wasn't bloodied. He hadn't been whipped. But he had bloodied Covey. Think about what that meant. A 16-year-old enslaved boy standing up to a grown man who'd built his entire reputation on breaking people, fighting him for 2 hours, making him bleed, and walking away undefeated. This wasn't just a physical fight. This was Douglas reclaiming everything that Covey had tried to take from him, his dignity, his sense of himself as a human being rather than property, his right to defend his own body from violence. All the things that 6 months of systematic brutality had crushed. They came back in that moment when he grabbed Covey by the throat and refused to let go. And for the next 6 months, Covey never touched him again, never hit him, never whipped him. Covey would occasionally say he didn't want to get hold of Douglas again. And Douglas would think to himself, "You don't need to, because you'll come off worse than you did before." Douglas said that fight was the turning point in his life as a slave. It rekindled what he called the few expiring embers of freedom. It revived his sense of his own manhood. It brought back his self-confidence and gave him back his determination to be free. He said that even though he remained enslaved for 4 more years, from that day forward he was a slave in form only. He would never again be a slave in fact. The fight had restored something essential to him: his dignity, his sense of self, his refusal to be broken. Now here's something interesting. Covey never reported what happened. Never had Douglas taken to a constable and whipped at the public whipping post, which he absolutely could have done. Legally, he had every right to have Douglas severely punished for daring to physically resist a white man. But Covey's entire livelihood depended on his reputation as a slave breaker. If word got out that a 16-year-old boy had fought him to a standstill and that Covey couldn't break him, that reputation would be destroyed. Other slave owners wouldn't send their difficult slaves to him anymore. His whole business model depended on being seen as unbeatable. So rather than admit what had happened, rather than risk his reputation, he just let it go. He let Douglas go unpunished because punishing him publicly would mean admitting that he'd failed. When Douglas's year with Covey ended on Christmas Day, 1833, he was sent to work for a man named William Freeland. Douglas described Freeland as an educated Southern gentleman compared to Covey. And that's saying something, because Freeland was still a slave owner. He still held people in bondage. He was still part of the same brutal system. But compared to Covey, he seemed almost humane. He didn't work people from before dawn until midnight. He didn't spy on them constantly. He didn't create an atmosphere of terror. On Freeland's plantation, Douglas started a secret school to teach other enslaved people how to read. They'd meet illegally in the house of a free black man. The school got so popular they had over 40 students. For enslaved people, learning to read was an act of resistance, a way to reclaim their humanity, a step toward freedom. But the system didn't want enslaved people to read. Education threatened the whole structure. If enslaved people could read, they could learn about abolition, about freedom movements, about the world beyond their plantations. They'd be harder to control. So teaching them was illegal. While at Freeland's, Douglas and a group of friends, Henry Harris, John Harris, Henry Bailey, and Charles Roberts, planned an escape. Douglas forged free passes for each of them, documents that would identify them as free men if they were questioned. They were going to run in pairs. But someone betrayed them. The authorities came. They quickly ate their passes so there'd be no evidence. They were jailed briefly, but eventually released because there was no proof of their plan. Eventually, in 1838, Douglas did escape to the north. He made it to New York, then to New Bedford, Massachusetts. He married Anna Murray, a free black woman who'd helped him escape. He changed his name from Frederick Bailey to Frederick Douglass. He started working as a caulker, earning his own money for the first time in his life. He joined the abolitionist movement and became one of its most powerful voices. In 1845, he published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. That's where he told the world about Edward Covey. He described Covey's methods in detail, the constant beatings, the psychological manipulation, the religious hypocrisy, the forced breeding of Carolyn, the atmosphere of terror, everything. The book became a sensation. It sold thousands of copies. People in the North read it and were horrified. Many of them had never fully understood what slavery actually meant in practice. They'd heard about it in abstract terms, but Douglas gave them specific details. He showed them exactly what slave breaker meant. He showed them what happened to Caroline. He showed them what it meant to be worked from dawn until midnight, to be beaten until you bled, to have your spirit systematically crushed. But here's what's important to understand about Edward Covey's story. He wasn't some aberration. He wasn't an unusually cruel outlier in an otherwise reasonable system. He was successful precisely because the system needed men like him. Slave owners actively sought him out. They paid him or sent him slaves for free specifically because of his brutality. His methods worked within the system. His cruelty was valuable. Think about what that means. The system of slavery required not just people who would own slaves and work them hard. It required people who could take someone with spirit, with resistance, with a sense of their own humanity, and systematically destroy all of that. It required specialists in breaking human beings. And men like Covey filled that role and were rewarded for it. Covey's reputation as a slave breaker meant that other slave owners could send their troublesome slaves to him and get them back broken, compliant, useful. The system rewarded him for what he did. He was building his fortune through his brutality. He was respected for it in his community among other slave owners. Young men probably looked at Covey and saw a path to success, a way to build wealth even if you didn't start with much. All you had to do was be willing to crush people's spirits for a living. And his religious faith didn't complicate any of this for him or for the people around him. He was a Methodist church member, a class leader. He prayed every day. He sang hymns. And everyone in his church and community knew what he did for a living. They knew he was a slave breaker. They knew about Caroline. Some of them probably even sent their own slaves to him. And they still welcomed him into their church, still treated him as a respectable Christian man, still let him lead Bible studies and prayer meetings. That's what the system did. It created men like Edward Covey. It rewarded them. It enabled them. And it wrapped everything in a veneer of Christian righteousness so they could feel good about what they were doing. So they could beat people until they bled on Saturday and lead church services on Sunday and see no contradiction between the two. Caroline spent her entire time on that farm being repeatedly raped, forced to bear children who would be born into slavery and owned by the man who'd bought her specifically for that purpose. She had to cook for Covey and his family, had to serve them, had to watch them celebrate the birth of her twins, like they were celebrating the acquisition of valuable livestock. And she had no recourse, no protection, no way out. Think about Caroline's life on that farm. Every single night, Covey locked her in a room with Bill Smith. Every single night for a year. She had no say in any of it. Her body wasn't her own. Her children wouldn't be her own. When she gave birth to twins, Covey and his wife were ecstatic, not because children had been born, but because Covey's property holdings had increased. The twins were valuable additions to his wealth. That's how they saw it. And during the day, Caroline had to function, had to cook meals, had to serve the family, had to go through the motions of daily life while being subjected to systematic rape every night. How do you survive that? How do you maintain any sense of yourself as a human being when the system has reduced you to a breeding animal and everyone around you treats that as completely normal and acceptable? Douglas wrote about Caroline because he wanted people to understand what slavery actually meant for women. It wasn't just labor. It wasn't just being owned. It was this. It was being purchased explicitly to be raped. It was having your children celebrated as property rather than as human beings. It was having no control over your own body, your own reproduction, your own life in the most fundamental ways. The other enslaved people on that farm lived in constant fear. They worked themselves to exhaustion. They never knew if Covey was actually gone or just hiding somewhere watching them. They were beaten regularly. They were the snake's victims, trapped in his system of psychological and physical torture. And all of this was completely legal. Everything Covey did was permitted under the law. He owned Caroline. She was his property to do with as he pleased. The other enslaved people were rented to him with the full knowledge and approval of their owners. The beatings, the overwork, the psychological terror. None of it violated any laws because enslaved people had no legal protections. They weren't considered fully human under the law. They were property. When Frederick Douglass fought back against Covey, he was technically committing a crime. An enslaved person physically resisting a white man was illegal. Covey could have had him arrested, whipped at the public post, maybe even killed. The law was entirely on Covey's side. Douglass had no legal right to defend himself. But Covey didn't use the law because doing so would have damaged his reputation. His silence protected his business interests. So inadvertently, his own greed and pride created the space where Douglass could reclaim his humanity and survive. After Douglass published his book in 1845, his identity as a fugitive slave was exposed. He had to flee to England to avoid being captured and sent back to slavery. He spent 2 years traveling through England, Ireland, and Scotland, speaking against slavery to crowds who'd read his book. Eventually, British supporters purchased his freedom from his legal owner, Thomas Auld, so he could safely return to America. Douglass went on to become one of the most important figures in the abolitionist movement. He founded his own anti-slavery newspaper. He advised President Lincoln during the Civil War. He recruited black soldiers for the Union Army. He continued to write and speak and fight for freedom and equality for the rest of his life. Edward Covey, meanwhile, continued his life as a slave breaker until the Civil War ended slavery. Then he just continued as a farmer. He lived into old age and died in Maryland. The system that had made him successful, that had rewarded his brutality, was destroyed. But he himself faced no consequences for what he'd done. No trial, no punishment, no accountability. He'd tortured dozens, maybe hundreds of people over his years as a slave breaker, and he was never held responsible for any of it. That's the system. That's how it worked. Men like Covey could build careers on cruelty. They could force women like Caroline into repeated sexual assault and celebrate the resulting children as additions to their wealth. They could beat teenagers like Frederick Douglass until they bled. They could create environments of constant terror and psychological manipulation. And they could do all of it legally, with the full support and approval of the society around them, while maintaining their standing as respectable Christian men. The only reason we know about Edward Covey is because one of his victims survived, escaped, learned to write, and told the world what happened. One of the people he tried to break refused to stay broken. One person who was supposed to be transformed from a man into a brute instead reclaimed his humanity and fought back. Frederick Douglass wrote, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." That was his introduction to the story of fighting Covey. He wanted people to understand that slavery tried to destroy your humanity, tried to reduce you to nothing. But he also wanted them to see that it was possible to resist, to fight back, to reclaim yourself. The fight with Covey was Douglas's resurrection, as he called it. It was the moment he stopped being just a victim and became someone who refused to accept what was being done to him. It didn't free him from slavery. He remained enslaved for 4 more years. But it freed something inside him that slavery had tried to kill. That's what makes the Covey story so important. It's not just about one cruel man. It's about the system that created him and men like him. It's about how slavery tried to break people, to crush their spirits, to turn them into the docile property that slave owners wanted. And it's about how some people fought back anyway, even when fighting back could cost them their lives. Edward Covey died in Maryland after the Civil War ended slavery. He lived to be an old man. He was never prosecuted for anything he'd done, never faced any consequences for the torture, for forcing Caroline into repeated rape, for beating Frederick Douglass and countless others until they bled. The system that made him successful and celebrated him for his cruelty was destroyed by a war. But Covey himself just lived out his life and died naturally. No accountability, no justice for his victims. Frederick Douglass went on to become one of the most important Americans of the 19th century. But he never forgot that year with Covey. He wrote about it multiple times across 3 different autobiographies. He came back to it again and again, because it was the turning point, the moment that shaped everything that came after. We know Caroline's name because Douglass wrote it down. We know she was forced to bear children as property. We know she was 20 years old. But we don't know anything else about her. We don't know if she survived that farm. We don't know if she ever saw freedom. We don't know what happened to her twins. The records don't tell us. Her story disappears after Douglass mentions her. We know Bill Smith's name, the man who was forced to rape Caroline every night for a year. We know he was hired from a neighboring plantation. We know Covey locked them together. But we don't know what he thought about being used that way. We don't know if he wanted to resist. We don't know his story beyond that one horrible detail. We know William Hughes was there, that Douglass fought him too. We know the other enslaved people on that farm called Covey the Snake. We know they lived in constant fear, but most of their names are lost. Most of their stories are gone. They suffered under Covey's brutality and then disappeared from the historical record. Douglass's story survived because he was extraordinary, because he learned to read and write despite it being illegal, because he escaped to freedom, because he had the courage and the skill to write down what happened to him and publish it for the world to see, because his voice was powerful enough that people listened. But for every Frederick Douglass who escaped and told his story, there were thousands who didn't. Thousands who were broken by men like Covey and stayed broken. Thousands who died before they could escape. Thousands whose stories were lost. That's the real horror of the slave breaker system. It wasn't just what Covey did to individuals. It was that the system made him possible. It made him desirable. It rewarded him. Other slave owners looked at Covey and thought he was providing a valuable service. They actively sought him out. They paid him or gave him free labor just to have access to his particular skill at breaking human beings. And Covey's Christianity didn't complicate this at all. He went to church every Sunday. He led his class in Bible study. He prayed every morning and every night. He sang hymns with his family, and then he went out and beat people until they bled. He forced a woman into repeated sexual assault. He created an environment designed to crush the human spirit. And nobody in his church or his community seemed to have a problem with any of it, because the system said it was fine. The system said enslaved people weren't fully human. The system said it was acceptable, even praiseworthy, to break them if they showed signs of resistance or independence. That's what slavery did. It created moral frameworks where cruelty became virtue, where forcing a woman to bear children as property became a smart business decision worth celebrating, where beating a teenager until his spirit broke became a respected profession. Frederick Douglass fought back. On that morning in Covey's stable, when Covey tried to tie his legs, something in Douglass said no. And he grabbed Covey by the throat, and they fought for 2 hours, and Douglass walked away, unbeaten. That wasn't the end of his slavery. He remained enslaved for 4 more years after that. But it was the end of him being broken. It was the moment he reclaimed something essential about himself, his dignity, his humanity, his refusal to accept what was being done to him. And here's what's remarkable about that moment. Douglass had every reason to just submit. Fighting back could have gotten him killed. If Covey had reported it, Douglass could have been whipped at the public post, maybe even executed. Legally, he had no right to defend himself. Morally, according to the system he lived in, he was wrong to resist. Everything in his world told him to just take the beating, accept his place, survive. But he fought anyway. Something in him refused to accept that this was all his life could be. Something survived 6 months of systematic brutality and said, no, this is not acceptable. I will not be reduced to this. That's the power of human dignity. That's what the system tried to crush, but couldn't quite destroy. Covey never reported it because doing so would have ruined his reputation. He let Douglass survive with his spirit intact, because his own pride and business interests mattered more than punishing this one enslaved teenager. That's what saved Douglass. Not any mercy or decency in Covey, but Covey's own selfish calculation about protecting his reputation. Think about that irony. The system that made Covey powerful also gave Douglass the space to survive. Covey's need to maintain his reputation as unbreakable meant he couldn't admit that a 16-year-old had fought him to a standstill. So he had to pretend nothing happened, and in that pretense, in that gap between what happened and what Covey could admit, Douglass found room to remain unbroken. The system tried to break Frederick Douglass. It sent him to the most notorious slave breaker in Maryland. It beat him weekly for 6 months. It worked him until he collapsed. It denied him protection when he asked for it. It did everything it could to turn him from a thinking, feeling human being into broken, obedient property. It failed. Not because the system had any flaws in its brutality, but because Douglass refused to stay broken. Because something in him survived that 6 months of torture and said, no, enough. I won't accept this anymore. But we have to remember, Douglass was extraordinary. He was uniquely talented, uniquely strong, uniquely lucky in some ways. Most people who were sent to Covey didn't fight back. Most people were broken and stayed broken. Most people didn't escape to tell their stories. Douglass himself acknowledged this. He knew he was the exception, not the rule. That's why his story matters so much, because he showed that even in the most brutal circumstances, even under the methods of the most notorious slave breaker, resistance was still possible. The human spirit could survive even when everything was designed to crush it. But his exceptionalism doesn't diminish the tragedy of all those who couldn't fight back, who were broken and stayed broken, whose stories were lost. That fight with Covey lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of a 16-year-old enslaved boy fighting the man who was supposed to break him. And when it ended, Douglas was still standing, still unbroken, still refusing to accept that he was property rather than a person. The years after that were still hard. He was still enslaved. He still had to plan his escape carefully. His first attempt failed, and he was jailed. But eventually he made it. He got to the North and freedom, and began the work of telling the world what slavery really was. And part of what he told them about was Edward Covey, the respectable Christian farmer who built his fortune on breaking human beings, the Methodist church leader who forced a woman into sexual slavery, the man who was called the Snake by the people he tormented. Douglas told the world about Covey because people needed to know. They needed to understand that slavery wasn't just an abstract economic system. It was this. It was Covey locking Caroline in a room every night. It was beating Douglas until he bled and calling it training. It was creating an environment where people lived in constant terror and calling it order. And it was all legal. It was all supported by the society around it. It was all wrapped in Christian language and celebrated as smart business. That's what the system did. That's what it enabled. That's what men like Covey represented. We remember Edward Covey now because Frederick Douglass refused to let the world forget him, refused to let Covey disappear into history as just another Maryland farmer. Douglass made sure people knew what slave breaker actually meant, made sure they understood the specific horrors behind that title, made sure Covey's cruelty was documented and exposed. But we should also remember what Douglass said about that fight. He called it his resurrection, his transformation from brute back into man, his moment of reclaiming his own humanity in a system designed to destroy it. That's what resistance looked like. Not escape, not yet. Not freedom, not yet. Just refusing to be broken. Just standing up and fighting back even when fighting back could get you killed. Just saying no to a system that said you had no right to say no. Frederick Douglass walked away from Edward Covey's farm after that year and went on to help change the world. Edward Covey stayed on his farm and continued breaking people until the system that made him valuable was finally destroyed. But for that one moment, for those 2 hours of fighting in the stable, a 16-year-old boy who was supposed to be broken instead broke something in the system itself. He proved that it was possible to resist, that the breaking wasn't inevitable, that humanity could survive even in the face of systematic cruelty designed to destroy it. That was the story. That's what happened. That's what we need to remember.